A well-executed heel turn can be one of the most exciting things to see in wrestling. After all, who could ever forget the time Shawn Michaels rammed Marty Jannetty's head through the barbershop window, or the time Hulk Hogan dropped the big leg on Randy Savage to form the NWO? That said, there is a flip side to this equation, and that flip side is switches to the villainous side of the alignment chart, which fail spectacularly for one reason or another. But what are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with maybe the most infamous and disastrous of all? And that's the time Steve Austin joined forces with Vince McMahon at WrestleMania 17. That's right, perhaps the most catastrophic heel turn of the history of the industry, as it pretty much directly led to the end of the turn of the millennium boom period in one fell swoop. Why was that? Well, we'll answer that question to you all. Who wants to boo their hero? And so, when Steve Austin decided to close out WrestleMania 17 on April 1st, 2001 in front of his home state of Texas no less, by aligning himself with his mortal enemy Vince McMahon, everyone hated it immediately. Seriously, it's amazing how quickly wrestling went from being the coolest thing on the playground to something no one was watching anymore after this, as with Austin no longer being the anti-hero bringing fans together, there was far less reason to tune in anymore. Sure, it wasn't just Austin's heel turn which killed the Attitude Era. No, there were other factors too, such as The Rock leaving for Hollywood, the terrible invasion angle, and the end of the Monday Night Wars. But ask anyone who was around at the time, and they'll tell you the main factor in them giving up was seeing a heel rattlesnake shaking hands with the boss. So why did he do it at all then? What purpose could it have possibly served for Stone Cold to turn to the dark side? Well, he believed his character needed a refresh. And while you could argue this was true, such a refresh wasn't the way to go, and a stadium filled with 67,000 Texans certainly wasn't the place to do it. But do it he did, and so just like that, the Attitude Era was over. But not every terrible heel turn is responsible for almost killing the business. No, others have had a far smaller effect. Not that it makes them any less terrible creatively though, and this was certainly the case for one of Austin's chief rivals in 2000. That's right, it's time to talk about Rikishi, and the time he did it for The Rock. Who the hell thought this was a good idea? Take one of the most over babyfaces on the roster at the time, someone on the verge of breaking out into the main event in full, and have him be revealed as the man who'd run over the rattlesnake with a car the year prior. Hell, Rikishi wasn't even on the roster at the time the incident took place, so it makes even less sense when you take this fact into account. But even if he had been there, it would still have sucked because there was so much more to be done with the Anoa'i family member as a babyface before anyone should have even considered turning him. Really, all you had to do was let him keep with Too Cool to keep fans happy and move him up the card to the point he was facing off against the likes of Triple H or Kurt Angle on pay-per-view. But in one of the rare outright fails of the Attitude Era, WWF chose to overcomplicate things by instead having the big man switch to the side of the villains, with his reason for attempting to end Stone Cold's life infamously being that he wanted his cousin The Rock to get the spotlight instead. And needless to say, fans did not take to this one, so pretty quickly Rikishi's stock would plummet to the point that, at WrestleMania 17, less than 6 months later, he wouldn't even be on the card. And considering he was supposed to be the next big thing prior to that, it just shows how disastrous this heel turn was. But then, you could argue it wasn't quite as bad as another which took place in 2018, as when Dean Ambrose was given the gas mask and the budget Bane trench coat, he was so peeved off, it led to him quitting the company. Now, turning Ambrose heel at this point wasn't necessarily a bad idea. Hell, it was probably the right thing to do if we're being honest. After all, his run as a babyface had been botched so badly he needed something new to freshen himself up. And the nature of his lunatic fringe gimmick meant he was always better suited to being a villain anyway. The problem here lies with the execution, as Ambrose would turn on his Shield teammate Seth Rollins, the very same night their brother-in-arms Roman Reigns would announce he was battling with cancer. Of course, this was seen as a little too distasteful for many fans, so it instantly put a damper on the whole heel turn right from the start. And on top of this, in the weeks following the heel turn, we would be introduced to Ambrose's new wacky character, one which led him to do things like wear a gas mask to the ring as he proclaimed that the fans in the arena smelled bad. That's right, instead of fans getting a whole new badass and barbaric hardcore character when he made this heel turn, we instead got him getting flu shots in his rear end while he portrayed something more of a wacky uncle. Really, you'd have to be trying hard if you wanted to come up with a worse heel turn for the man than this. And Ambrose clearly hated it too. So much so, in fact, that when his contract came up early the following year, he'd refuse to sign a new one and would instead go on to join the then fledgling AEW. And because of how badly the whole thing went, Dean Ambrose is unlikely to return to the WWE in the near future. That said, as CM Punk has shown us, you can never fully say never in wrestling. But it wasn't just in his later years as a booker that Vince McMahon was making questionable decisions when it came to turning people heel. No, he was actually doing the same thing all the way back in 1996, and we can say that for certain because this was the year he decided that Jim Ross really needed to become a bad guy. Of course, this was a bad decision for obvious reasons. After all, who wants to boo JR? Even in the modern day where he's not the commentator he once was, you'd still be hard-pressed to find fans who dislike him. And what made this heel turn all the worse was that it was clear Ross was the stand-in for Vince McMahon on this occasion, as his shift to the side of the villains only came about around the time Kevin Nash and Scott Hall left to go join WCW. That's right, it started when, in kayfabe, Ross felt slighted by WWF management, and so began acting out on screen. And this all reached its peak when, following the exits of the Outsiders, he began lambasting the company for allowing the pair to quit, then from there explained he was the only man who could bring them back into the fold. Would he do this? Sort of. Because on the September 23rd episode of Raw, the Oklahoma boy appeared in the ring to announce the re-signing of Big Sexy and the Bad Guy. The only problem with this, though, was that when the duo came through the curtain after that, it quickly became clear that it wasn't Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. No, instead it was two pretenders played by Glenn Jacobs and Rick Bogner, something fans immediately rejected. And it's very likely Vince McMahon knew all too well they were going to reject this, which is probably the reason he had JR be portrayed on screen as the one bringing them in, so that he could use him as a human shield for all the heat being created. But people weren't booing Ross. No, they loved good old JR. Rather, they were booing the booking instead. And that's why, realizing things weren't working, the boss would drop not only the fake Diesel and Razor angles soon thereafter, but also the entire heel turn for the commentary legend as well. And because it was so short-lived then, this one would have minimal negative effect on the voice of the Attitude Era's career. That said, other commentators over the years which followed wouldn't be so lucky, as when it comes to Michael Cole, his heel turn in 2011 began to create a stigma surrounding him that he was a bad commentator. Seriously, what is it with Vince McMahon and turning commentators heel? And no, we don't believe Michael Cole sucks. In fact, in our eyes, he's underrated if anything. You can see this whenever he's allowed to call a show without the boss shouting in his ear. But in 2011, no one was happy to hear his voice on Monday nights, as this was pretty much the peak of WWE's terrible commentary. With everything sounding so robotic and corporate, it was honestly better to just watch with the sound off. The only thing which could make it worse, in fact, would be if Cole had turned into an obnoxious heel announcer. And wouldn't you know it, that's exactly what happened here. So rather than get dull and lifeless commentary, we instead got a truly grating period where the Syracuse native began calling shows from his own cordoned-off plastic booth named the Coal Mine, all while he was regularly trashing the babyfaces in the most cartoonish manner possible. But that wasn't all. No, the pain would get worse still, as at WrestleMania 27 on April 3rd, 2011, the then voice of the company actually stepped into the ring and went almost 14 minutes with Jerry Lawler. Yes, the biggest show of the year, fans had to sit for a quarter of an hour, not including entrances, and watch as a man who'd never wrestled before stunk up the show and took time away from others like CM Punk and Randy Orton. Hell, he even won the match by disqualification. And that still wasn't the end of his run as a bad guy, because it continued on well into 2012 too, at which point he'd actually returned to the ring to enter that January's Royal Rumble. We can only hope now that Triple H is booking the show there will be no more heel commentators getting in the ring anytime soon, because there has never been a situation we can think of where this idea has worked out. That said, at least Michael Cole only turned that once, so it could be worse. He could be like Paul White and turn every 10 minutes or so. Yes, we're talking about the man with more switches in alignment than perhaps any other wrestler ever, The Big Show. And the reason he's included in this video isn't because of any one particular turn. No, a few of them were pretty good in fact, such as the time he sided with Paul Heyman at the 2002 Survivor Series, and from there beat Brock Lesnar for the WWE title. For the most part though, his constant shifts from heel to face and back to heel again have watered his character down so much, it's now gotten to a point where no one will ever be able to take him seriously again. And that's a crying shame, because if used right, he really could have been a more modern day version of Andre the Giant. All he had to do was be treated like a special attraction who had some consistency to his character, not a man with apparent split personality syndrome who can't go longer than a few weeks without changing sides. But sadly, this never happened, and so we're now currently at a point in 2023 where he's sitting at a staggering 36 over the course of his career, with 18 of these being heel turns. Is there a chance things could still be salvaged for the big man? Not really, as with him being 51 and all but retired outside of a few special appearances here and there for AEW, his days in the ring are pretty much over as it stands today. But at least now that he's no longer wrestling regularly, it means he won't be turning anymore, right? Well, we wouldn't say that for sure. Hell, there's always a chance he decides to go after Tony Schiavone while working on the commentary booth and... oh god, more heel commentators, please, no! No, that's really the last thing we all need as wrestling fans at this point. But then we also never needed a certain wrestler to ever turn heel, and that didn't stop them from being booked to do so in the past. Who are we talking about this time? Why, who else but perhaps the biggest failed example of a mega face going heel outside of Steve Austin, and that's Bill Goldberg. That's right, it's time to talk about late period WCW, so you know this one's gonna be awful. It all happened when, after realizing just how bad things were getting for WCW in 2000, and just how quickly they were siphoning off viewers each and every week, writer Vince Russo came up with the idea to shock fans back into watching by doing something they'd never see coming, and that thing they'd never see coming ended up being Goldberg's shift to the dark side at that June's Great American Bash pay-per-view. A move so exciting and game-changing, it caused even more people to stop watching. Honestly, there's a reason some ideas have never been booked before in wrestling, and it's because those ideas just don't need to be done. And in 2000 WCW, there was no worse idea than to take the only babyface star keeping the company afloat and have him become a villain. Yes, if Austin's heel turn killed the Attitude Era, then you could argue this was almost equally as damaging in that it was pretty much the final nail in the coffin of WCW, especially when said heel turn gave us such utter gems as Bill refusing to follow the script and go up for a powerbomb during a match with Kevin Nash and Scott Steiner. No, you didn't mishear us, this actually happened, and commentary actually acknowledged it at the time as him not doing as he'd been written to do by the bookers. It honestly beggars belief that this made it out of the writer's room in the first place, and the reception of both it and the overall catastrophe that was Goldberg's time as a bad guy led to WCW desperately trying to turn him back babyface again a couple of months later, with them not realizing that by then it was too late and the damage had already been done. If only Goldberg could have remained babyface until the end of the company's run, then we might have at least gotten one last good story with him in the promotion, or possibly even a second world title reign. But alas, we didn't, and you all know what happened next. By March of the following year, World Championship Wrestling was out of business, and there would be no major alternative to WWF for almost 2 decades, meaning wrestling fans everywhere suffered as a result. Sure, you did have places like TNA people could watch, but they were never a true competitor to Vince McMahon's crown. And part of the reason for that was because of terrible booking decisions, such as the time they turned AJ Styles heel in 2010 and had him morph into a budget Ric Flair. Now, Styles does a lot of things. High-flying superstar, one of the best wrestlers of his generation, and not only a 2-time former WWE champion, but also a former 2-time IWGP heavyweight champion and 5-time TNA world champion as well. One thing he most certainly isn't, however, is a playboy, and that's why the decision Impact made to book him like one at the start of the 2010s was so baffling then. Sure, there was some method to the madness here, as the Phenomenal One had just become a member of Fortune at that point, Ric Flair's TNA version of the Four Horsemen, and so if he was going to be a member of this group then he'd have to act the part, and acting the part meant doing as the Nature Boy did at all times. The only problem with this though was that AJ was, and still is, a devout family man and Christian. Certainly not the kind of person who's going to be out partying to all hours of the morning, drinking heavily, and picking up women. And he absolutely wasn't someone who should wear a robe down to the ring then strut about the squared circle like he was Slick Rick back in 80s Jim Crockett Promotions. Honestly, it was all just a bit jarring and felt wildly out of character for the person fans of the then Nashville-based product had come to know and love. What they wanted wasn't this Ric Flair pretender. No, they wanted the man who had used his incredible acrobatic skills to help make the X Division one of the most exciting in all of wrestling during the 2000s. And it was clear that this was what AJ really wanted too, as every time he was made to get in the ring and deliver a woo at the top of his lungs, you could tell just how forced it was. So thank God the whole thing was dropped soon thereafter then, and AJ was allowed to return to being himself, as this was all he ever really needed to be in the first place if he wanted to get over. Yes, sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you want to make a star. No, for the most part, all you have to do is let a performer do what they do best. So why WCW thought it would be a good idea to take Mr. Red, White, and Blue, Jim Duggan, and turn him heel in 2000 by joining Team Canada is anyone's guess. Okay, well, we do know why this one happened, and it rhymes with Schminz-Gusso. Honestly, no matter how bad anything on any other wrestling show gets in the future, nothing will ever be as bad as the sheer level of wrestle crap that was generated by this particular promotion on this particular year. But why was the decision to turn American hero Hacksaw heel by siding with the dastardly Canadians made in the first place? Because it would be a hell of a swerve, bro. And sure, it might have been a hell of a swerve that no one saw coming, but like with Goldberg's heel turn, there was a reason this one had never been tried in WCW before. And there was certainly a reason it hadn't been done in such a manner that saw Duggan betray his country. After all, by this point in his career, the New York native wasn't exactly relying on his in-ring work or his promo skills to keep him over. No, he was living off of pure nostalgia, and that nostalgia was centered on him defending the Stars and Stripes at all costs. So when he stopped doing this and instead became a lover of maple syrup and Mounties and all other things native to the Great White North, fans had no reason to care about him anymore. And we're pretty sure Team Canada weren't too hot on the idea either, as they already had plenty of talent in their stable, with names such as Lance Storm, Carl Ouellet, and Jacques Rougeau making up their ranks. But WCW in 2000 was not a place where bad ideas got scrapped just because they were bad. No, this was a place where American heroes suddenly became honorary Canadians for no good reason. And that wouldn't be the only time Jim Duggan was involved in a terrible heel turn as it happened, though when it happened again in 2006, it would be in WWE, and it wouldn't be him switching to the dark side. No, it would be Eugene instead. Okay, where do we start with this one? Well, Eugene was certainly a controversial character at the time, as putting Vince McMahon in charge of delicately handling someone who had a learning difficulty was like giving a box of matches to an arsonist. It was nevertheless praised in some circles, largely because of Nick Dinsmore's work portraying the lovable gimmick. Come late 2006 though, almost a full 2 years after his debut, the act was starting to wear a little thin, and that's why it was decided that a change was needed at this point. But that change should never have been to turn Eugene heel. Hell, the whole thing was enough of a powder keg at the best of times, and making the developmentally challenged guy the villain made many fans at the time uncomfortable. And we can't imagine Nick Dinsmore felt comfortable about the new direction he was being asked to go in either when he turned on his partner Jim Duggan on the November 6th episode of Raw that year after the pair had lost a World Tag Team title match against the Spirit Squad. But for some reason, WWE chose to go with this one anyway, and so began one of the most uncomfortable heel runs of all time, as live crowds everywhere tried their best to justify to themselves that it was okay to jeer Eugene without feeling bad about it. Thankfully then, this one didn't last too long, as before the year was over, the Indiana native would be a babyface once more, and everyone could just try to forget this one ever happened.